Why does it seem like every election season, and by the way, in most areas, there's an election every year, whether it's municipal, state, or federal level. But why does it seem like every election season, there are some campaigns that just seem to really focus on having a campaign based on fear, while others try to build on this much more complex idea of building an idea of hope? Well, the answer to that really tells us everything we should know about how the campaigns that we see run for people who are trying to represent us in various ways have the ability to impact entire populations. Before diving into what it all means, let me give you some examples. And here I just pulled up some examples from history. And this isn't new. Back in the 60s, we had the Lyndon B. Johnson famous political ad of Daisy and the nuclear blast. We had KKK for Goldwater. Again, another Lyndon B. Johnson political ad. We had Bear in the Woods, which is Ronald Reagan really arguing that the Cold War and being much more aggressive against the Soviet Union was the way to keep us all safer. Then we have the George H.W. Bush, Willie Horton ad. That was one of the most out of context attacked ads that our country has ever seen up to that point. And then we also had the revolving door ad from George H.W. Bush. Then we had, in the more recent era, the government death panels when we were talking about how to overhaul healthcare, which was never true. We had the nuclear Iran, which the Republican Party really ran on. All their super PACs got on board with when we were trying to negotiate a deal with Iran. Then we had the immigration caravan that was coming to invade us. It seemed to disappear the day after the election, regardless of how it turned out. Then we had the China virus and trying to stoke fears against China leading up to the 2020 election. Then we had how the defund the police rhetoric was weaponized against Democrats to mean something it was never intended to mean. To be fair, Democrats, we need to get better at labeling stuff. But at the end of the day, this whole graphic is really just meant to make the point that using a fear-based political approach is nothing new, and it is often successful. Why is it successful? You see, here's what it all boils down to. Fear is primal. It really triggers the fight or flight response. In political science, we can see study after study where populations that feel afraid tend to be more conservative. They want more security and they're willing to give up more freedoms for that security. For those of us old enough to remember what it felt like after 9/11 as we were standing up, all these new national security laws that really fundamentally changed privacy and a whole bunch of other things, it happened really fast. Why? Because most average day Americans were genuinely afraid for the first time. Unfortunately, what does this also do? It overly simplifies the actual problems and often stops solutions from even coming forward. It backs us into these survival narratives that we have to be all one way or all the other in order for us to not be afraid anymore, which just isn't true. Fear-based campaigns often also spike right before elections because they're really effective at driving turnout. Just think about what it meant for yourself. If you're really afraid about what might happen if you don't vote, are you more likely to vote? The answer for most of us is yes. Now, on the other side of that, you have the politics of hope. See, fear is easy. You can make a lot of people afraid of a lot of different with very little language. Fear is built into us. It goes back to our ancestry of trying to survive. But we've also had these large periods of history where shared prosperity and hope wasn't just some throwaway line that a politician says to try to get you excited. It spawned the progressive era, starting in the 1930s, coming out of the Great Depression, all the way through the 1980s, where we saw wealth inequality largely compress. Not true for everyone, but true for a lot of folks. The civil rights movement came out of that. It was tied, and people forget about this. The civil rights movement was not just a movement based on racial lines. It was a movement also based on economic lines. And what do we get when we have politicians of both parties, it's fair to say, really focus on prosperity and what can we do? You get all the post-World War II investments in the middle class that created the largest booming middle class in the history of the world. And what happens to a population that is largely sharing the prosperity that we're all creating together? And I'm not saying socialism, I'm just saying a more fair distribution of income, is that you get a politics that's really looking around and says, hey, things are pretty good, and what else good can we do? You get a politics of infusion of ideas and infusion of belonging. You get people who feel secure enough, especially economically, where they're no longer in the scarcity mindset. So people, and we can prove this out in political science studies, are far more likely to support welfare programs for when times do get hard for individual people. There's a bigger safety net for them. Why? Because people aren't afraid when they're sharing prosperity. They want the safety net there for them too, if you ever need it. So it really sounds all good to sit here and just say, like, we should all just lean into the politics of hope, but real hope that can actually drive change. But here's the reality. Fear-based politics is here because it works. And what do we do to make it so that it isn't as effective, so less politicians actually keep choosing it over and over again? Here's 4 basic ideas that I wish every viewer would consider. First and foremost, when you're seeing headlines that are really emotionally triggering you, check the source. Before you do anything else, check the source of where that information is coming from. I'll do some other videos that really takes a system approach of creating your own framework so you can better understand it for yourself. But the first thing you need to do, check the source. Does that source or whoever is sponsoring the ad at the very least have a vested interest in you being afraid? Most of the time, the answer is yes. And that can help us step past the ads that we see that emotionally trigger us in certain ways. Second part, look for the data. Once you check the source of the ad, look for the underlying data. With AI-enabled tools, you can have our AI agents and AI tools that are at all of our fingertips fact check it for you. Ask if it's real. Ask if this is how often it's happening. Here's the thing to consider though when checking the data, especially when you're checking it about things that make you afraid. Crime, for example. Unfortunately, crime is with us all the time. And what you really need to check is the data of how much it compares to different moments in time, compare one geography to another. You don't want to look for crime data and expect to see no crime, because if you do get crime data that is 0, it's likely to just be wrong. So check the data, check and compare it to what you would expect a reasonable outcome to be. Third, think about investing in the community at large. And that doesn't have to be through the government, by the way. But once you check the source, once you check the data, really ask yourself, how do we grow prosperity and who do we need to include in that for the entire community for it to make sense for all of us? That community could be your family. It could be your neighborhood. It could be your town. It could be your school district. It could be your state. It could be your country. It could be a bunch of different things. But when we step outside of just us and our own feelings, it's a good check on whether or not we think it's a good idea. If we think it's a good idea for our community, then that's a step in the right direction. Finally, should ask whether a policy expands fairness or just stokes fear. And this is all about reframing a debate. And we can do this real time for politicians. If they're giving town halls and they're spouting off talking points that really lean in to this fear ideology, just reframe it. Ask them to say how this actually leads to anything that's fair. At the end of the day, fear, unfortunately, is like a flashlight. Feels really good and powerful when it all feels dark out there. It can spotlight some important things. It will really, though, make you focus on immediate threats. Prosperity and hope is more like the sun rising. It expands vision, not just for you, but for everyone. It allows you to take in a whole lot more of what is really going on. It lets you see the whole landscape and actually make a real plan for the future instead of just spotlighting one problem after another without ever solving them in the first place. And that's what I want everyone to walk away with. Just understanding that fear-based politics really shrinks perspective to a point where we don't actually solve the problems. And that's the point of it for a lot of the politicians that are using it. Demand more of our politicians. Whether you're left, right, or center, wherever you are in the political spectrum, demand that you hear from your own politicians what they think their plans are for building a better future. Ask the question. Ask it over and over and over again until you get an answer. And if you keep getting fear-based answers, we can't do that because then all this will be terrible. Vote for different politicians. Thank you. If you haven't yet, please click like on this video, drop a comment below, and click that subscribe button. It'll help the YouTube algorithm make sure that these videos are getting into your feed. Thank you.